Today we're going to be talking about navigating the cloud, strategies to maximize return on investment. And we're going to take a little bit of a kind of high-level view of digital transformation as a whole, and then dig deeper on specific tools that help you manage cost and manage resources in Azure, and tools that help you plan your project successfully. So just a little bit about today's speakers. I'm Marcus Idle. I'm one of the practice heads in Cocho. Been with Cocho for just over 10 years. And Matt, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Afternoon, everyone. So Matthew Richards, and I look after our secure digital transformation practice. Bit of a mouthful, but I've also been with Cocho around 10 years.
Fantastic. So just to look at the agenda, so introductions we've done, and we're going to very briefly touch on who we are as a company. And then, as I said, we'll talk about digital transformation at a high level, and then dive into some of the tools and strategies we use and we help our clients use for managing their cloud projects and their investment. And then finally, we'll dig into a couple of recent case studies, and then go to Q&A. So just a little bit about Cocho. We're a company of 400, just over 400. We are a top tier Microsoft partner. Major clients in all sectors, and our emphasis, our specialization is really around identity and security, but that touches a number of areas, including application development, end user compute, platform security. We also wrap our services with change management and business transformation and managed services and support. So after developing a new project or a system, we offer a managed service wrap to keep that system going. And as I said, our expertise is around identity, endpoints, and security. So let's dive in. When we talk about digital transformation, we can be talking about any number of things, from paper processes that need to be transformed, on-premise services, insecure applications and services, systems that are siloed, they don't talk to each other, and systems that rely too heavily on people inside your business doing the work rather than your clients and partners and suppliers. So it's all about and manual processes. So it's all about kind of bringing those systems and processes into the modern day and age. So turning from paper to electronic, on-prem to cloud, insecure to secure, siloed to unified, processes talking to each other, internal to external, so making sometimes your external customers and partners do the work, and of course automating processes which can be automated. So why would we do this? So we face some challenges as businesses. These never go away. The goalposts keep moving, unfortunately. But one of them is cost. So quite often, legacy IT will be the one of the most cost-consuming parts of your IT budget. It gets more and more expensive to run legacy systems, and relying on tin instead of lightweight cloud services and so on. And security. That's the goalpost that keeps moving too. But we can, instead of putting all of our own resources and effort into making our applications secure, we can do some things which allow us to rely on Microsoft for an evergreen on-tap solution to help us with threat detection and modern methods of sign-in and so on. Usability is super important because if we have any kind of competition, or even if we own a monopoly, usability helps our the people who consume our service to consume it easily, which means they don't drop out of the process. So consistent application design and easy to use sign-in and easy to use applications are key to making our cloud services work. And then finally, complexity. Obviously, as companies grow, as any company grows, we naturally add complexity to our systems, and it's all about kind of making sure we're continually looking at that and breaking it down. So we've developed a bit of a maturity model for digital transformation, and it might help if you try and place yourself somewhere in this maturity model. So level one would be you only have some online processes. So you probably have a lot of processes which could be online and aren't. Level two, you have some single sign-ons. So if you have more than one web application that your external or internal people use, you have some SSO between them. So there's no confusion about signing into multiple applications. And you might have some CRM integrations. So anytime a customer interacts with you, that's recorded against their record in the CRM. So your customer support or your other support systems can have an up-to-date single view of the customer. And then level three, you've got some usability standards going on. So instead of multiple applications written by different vendors that look very different, you've got some conformity, which gives a lot of comfort to your customers. You have better CRM integration. So maybe some applications which are built on Power Apps, for example, which is hooking directly into your CRM. And maybe you have some threat mitigation. So you have some way of detecting the threat level posed by your users, whether they're customers or maybe it's a botnet that's trying to sign into your system, and you can deal with that threat. And then finally, level four, we have all of the previous, but as well as single sign-on, you have some bring your own identity, so people can sign in with their Gmail or Facebook. They don't have to create new passwords in your system. You have lightweight services, so some of your applications may still be built in Visual Studio or Java or whatever it is, but a lot of them are using lightweight services such as the app service on Azure instead of consuming a whole virtual machine or even an actual piece of tin. Same with databases and so on. Some of your applications, where appropriate, are low or no code. So, for example, Power Apps, which integrate directly into Dynamics. You have your threat mitigation, and you also have your analysis. So we'll talk much more about this later on. So you can analyze how you're consuming services in Azure, for example, and how they're being costed. So I'm going to illustrate some of this with a composite case study. We've got some real life case studies to talk about in a few minutes, but this one's just a composite one to illustrate some of these improvements that digital transformation can make for your business. So we have a local council, and my interaction with that council is I'd like to have a drop curb outside my house. So I send in a letter with a check, and of course they have to update me and tell me they've received that, and maybe organize a date with me to have that work done. And then that work is done, that happens. The next time I want to interact with the council, I would need to send another letter and tell them what I want now, and that's a whole different interaction. They may not kind of track me between these two interactions. So the first step is maybe I make one of these an online form, So that's great. So customers don't have to, find an actual envelope and a stamp and so on to have that interaction. But I've still got some phone updates, and I'm not kind of really kind of integrated with CRM. So perhaps the next step would be I've got some case management available to me as a consumer. So I can edit the date, I can change the appointment date and that kind of thing. And that would interact with CRM. So the people who are serving that request have a single view of who I am. And then, next step would be obviously integrating more services and making sure that when I sign in, I'm signing in as the same person. They might be different web applications that I'm using, but they use a central point of reference for authentication. Could be Enter ID, for example, or Enter External ID. And then finally, sort of the nirvana is I'm using Power Apps and it's kind of integrated with CRM. Not saying it's for every application. Some applications will need, completely custom code, but it's a way of capturing and managing a lot of cases. In the case of our fictional council. So, what kind of technology are we talking about here? We are we mentioned app services, so these are a very lightweight model to replace, a web server or sitting on a virtual server or an actual server. Azure functions are even more lightweight, so you can write a single function and use that as an API as part of a microservices model or an API layer. Same with database services and other services on Azure. Equally, I mentioned CRM and Power Apps as a sort of front end to this, but you can integrate any of these kind of front end tools with your CRM of choice. Visual Studio or Java or front end single page applications. To, as I mentioned, not everything is solved by a low code / no code solution. And then for authentication, we would naturally recommend Enter External ID for customers. So this is a sort of great way of kind of integrating single sign-on with all your applications and receiving that on tap set of features. So new ways of sign-in are on tap when they're developed, including recently things like passkeys, so biometric sign-in on your device. So you use a password once and then enable passkeys, and then thereafter you can use biometrics. The same is true for social sign-in, Google, Facebook, and so on. Very easy way for customers to kind of sign in and interact with you, and you get this the heavyweight security on tap as well. And then there are other tools which kind of help you kind of organize your Azure resources and manage cost and understand where cost is being drained, and Matt's going to talk about those in just a minute. And a tool that we've developed, Coach Evolve, to help you with the whole project lifecycle. So again, I'll hand over for Matt for that in a second. So just to reiterate the benefits, so once we've kind of deployed all of that and kind of reached our nirvana level of the maturity model, we've got those cost savings because we've typically a lot of them are related to kind of moving from tin into the cloud. We've got better customer experience and engagement, which of course helps us in terms of our competition, making sure we're ahead of the game. We've got data-driven decision making as well. So once we have everything linked into our CRM, for example, we have a lot more data about what's going on in our environment, and we can make better decisions as to customer behavior, what customers want, where we can apply automation, and so on. And then we've got greater scalability, readiness for innovation. So we've got a sort of more lightweight model, so we can be a little bit more flexible. and stronger compliance and risk posture. So again, mostly driven by that authentication piece, but there's a lot of other benefits of moving into the cloud. So I'm going to hand over to Matt, who's going to dive into Code to Evolve.
Fantastic. I think I have unmuted myself, clicked on all the necessary buttons. So excellent, like getting a thumbs up, which is always good to see. So afternoon, everybody. So I am going to, I guess, sort of continue the conversation from Marcus. Marcus has highlighted a number of sort of key areas that we can really benefit from in terms of looking at modern technologies like cloud technologies to start helping us automate tasks and so on and so forth. But where do we start? So Marcus mentioned earlier something called Code to Evolve. So Code to Evolve is something that we have been developing probably for the last 2 to 3 years. It's a framework, as the slide says, but we've put quite a bit of work and effort into this. It's been run through the mill in terms of the value it presents in terms of how we deliver our projects. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about exactly what that is. So let me see if I can progress the slide. So in essence, Code to Evolve is a framework, and it's a framework that's not just a point in time. It's a framework that helps us, first of all, start the journey to the cloud or embark on a new service or technology or solution, whatever it might be, but also one that is sort of agile and allows us to adapt as the business grows, because obviously nothing stays static. Things change as we grow, market changes, customers change, etc., etc. So there will always be change inherent in our businesses, and so this framework allows us to adapt to those changes and continually sort of evolve as an organization. So the Code to Evolve, sorry, I thought I'd advanced 2 slides there, but I haven't. I'm on the right one, which is good. So it's a framework, it's a full life cycle framework that actually we're really proud of. And we've taken a lot of learnings from well-established frameworks. So you'll see a mention, I'm not going to read all this out, but you'll see a mention to the Microsoft CAF or Cloud Adoption Framework. That's probably something that you're familiar with. That is fully documented on the Microsoft website, but this is a framework from Microsoft that achieves something similar and is aligned to Code to Evolve. But Code to Evolve allows us to sort of take a much broader approach. So it's not necessarily just for cloud adoption. We can apply Code to Evolve and its framework to pretty much any project or solution that we're introducing into an organization. And just to add to this, the framework itself has been audited and reviewed by external auditors, and we've had the thumbs up. So in terms of alignment to things like compliance and covering security and all the relevant areas, we had that rubber stamp from an external organization, which is always good to have. So, I mean, what is Code to Evolve? So I guess at its highest level, this is what comprises Code to Evolve. These are the phases that make up the framework. We start with the top left there, which is define. Now, define is a phase in the framework that really is technology agnostic. So we do not talk about typically technology in this phase. So this phase is all about really getting to understand how your business operates. What are the mechanics that make this business work? So that involves understanding, what you do, how the internal processes work, and it'll involve a number of, I guess, workshops, interviews, questions, questionnaires. We have a raft of different mechanisms to be able to extract that information or collate that information organization. But we typically will have our solution architect involved in this phase, but typically we'll also have our business analysts involved, because they understand the language of the business better typically than somebody more technically focused. And it may be necessary that we introduce our change architects. So these are people who understand the impact of introducing new services, new solutions, or new approaches into an organization, and can help us manage the adoption of those in an efficient and an effective way. Because it's really important that any investment you make in any technology, any project, that you get the, what you expect to get out from a value perspective. And more often than not, what we see is, in absence of appropriate sort of change and adoption management, we see a lot of friction in organizations and things that were unexpected, and they in essence take time and ultimately cost money. So, for that ideal sort of scenario, we have those three personas. So the solution architect, the business analyst, and the change and adoption architect as well. So we gather exactly what you're seeking to achieve. And in the scenario that this webinar is, the topic of the webinar is obviously cloud adoption. And so, what are you expecting by moving to the cloud? What is the business expecting from that? What is the finance department expecting from that, et cetera, et cetera. So we get a very clear view of your requirements. There will be some technical requirements, obviously, that form part of that overall picture, but we gather all of those. Again, we don't talk about technology. We're not talking about a specific approach or a tool or anything like that. We're gathering the picture, or painting the picture, so we've got an absolutely crystal clear and considered view of exactly what the business is expecting. Then, having got that, we move to the right into the second phase, which is the plan phase. Now, this is where we do start talking about technology and a lot of other things. In terms of a cloud adoption approach, we'll need to understand what your current estate is. What makes up that estate? What moving parts are there? What hypervisors do you have? What virtual machines? What operating systems do they run? What applications are you running? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what is that current state, and what should the future state look like? So this, I guess, you could think of this as where we would start to develop the detailed plans, the detailed designs for whatever it is that we're embarking on. And then moving further to the right, this is where we'll start actually putting some development work into what we've understood, what we've agreed that we're going to do, and now we start doing that work. So this is where we look at things like landing zones. Marcus mentioned those earlier. These are really critical elements of any form of cloud adoption, and I'll talk a little bit more about those shortly. But this is where we really start defining those elements and putting, applying configuration, developing code, whatever it might be. And then on the far right, adopt. So this is where we start implementing the things that we've developed in terms of the solution. Maybe it could be a landing zone, could be a number of different things. So this is where the work actually starts to become real and starts getting applied to the platform that you're using. And then from a continual sort of evolution perspective or operational management perspective, what we've indicated here or assumed in this slide is that, we have a professional services or consulting engagement that takes you from define through to adopt. And then from an ongoing management and operation perspective, in this scenario, this is where Coach would take that solution and manage it on your behalf, considering, excuse me, those three sort of key areas: secure, manage, and govern. And we do that across all of our managed services clients. But equally, these could be elements that you would continue if a managed service wasn't something that you were pursuing. But they're very important to consider. Never that there's no such thing as, right, we'll create this, we'll implement it, and then we can forget about it. we need to continually sort of manage that platform or solution, whatever it is, in terms of those key areas. Okay, let's get on to the next slide. So what I've got here is just an example really of what a high level or the top level of an Azure landing zone is. Azure landing zones are an absolutely critical component of any project that's moving somebody from an on-premises environment, typically legacy, into a more modern cloud-based platform. And the landing zone allows us to sort of define what we need to consider, what we need to achieve, and what is important. So what you've got in the slide in front of you is, again, an example of a production and a test environment. So this is where we're starting to consider what are the moving parts of my platform or my Azure platform here in this example. What subscription should I be using? What does the billing, how should the billing work? Should we have multiple subscriptions to be able to apportion costs to different business units in the organization? What applications and services are we going to be running? And therefore those will typically need separate landing zones to describe certain agreed policies and controls that are important to make sure those are secure and compliant and so on and so forth. So this is in terms of what we call the top level management group hierarchy, sort of describing the beginnings of, if you like, of a landing zone. And to give you an example of what a landing zone typically looks like with applications and services within it. It's a slightly busy slide. I'm not really intending you to really focus in too much on it, but you can see the top level that was on the previous slide right at the top there, and then the build-up of the additional landing zones that describe the services and applications that you're going to be running. And each one of those will typically be, from billing perspective, will have its own subscription, but this is where we can start to define very specific roles or policies that control things like role assignments, security controls, and any form of compliance requirements that we're obliged to maintain. So these are things that we can apply to that particular landing zone, so that when applications are lit up within that landing zone, automatically those policies are applied, and it's not a manual task to go and enable a number of those things. So you can see quite a lot of elements there. A typical landing zone for a mid-sized organization would be significantly larger than this, right? And it would have a lot more moving parts. But a very important and quite frankly fundamental part of your activities that you need to consider when you're moving to the cloud. Okay. So before we can move, so imagine we're in a sort of traditional sort of legacy environment at the moment. Most of our services are on premises. Maybe we've got some private clouds on-prem running on various different hypervisors, lots of different services and so forth. You may be, hosting your platform in a separate data center, whatever that scenario is. Before we start considering moving on to the Azure platform, we need to start getting clarity and details about what have we got in the environment first and foremost. So what does my digital estate look like currently? So we can leverage various tools, one of which available from Microsoft is Azure Migrate. So it's a very powerful tool that allows you to, perform an inventory scan at its beginning, right? So tell me everything about my environment. And it will do an awful lot more than that. So it'll also pick up on servers and hosts that you've got, applications running on them, as well as things like interdependencies that from a networking perspective as well. And these activities are typically performed in the Azure Migrate Decide phase. So these are Microsoft defined phases, and I'll come on to in a minute how they they sort of align to the Coach to Evolve framework. But this is in the decide phase. This is where we start building a picture of, what have we got, and also start understanding, well, what would that look like if I was to migrate these onto the Azure platform? What would that cost potentially be? And it allows you to then, further reinforce a business case, maybe develop the business case. Maybe this is something that you might want to consider prior to making the decision to go to the cloud. That would be a sensible move. So understand, cost is very important, and to be crystal clear here, just shifting everything onto the cloud is not something that typically presents cost savings, right? That's not something that certainly we would recommend doing. So there needs to be care and attention in terms of how you move those services, applications, and resources onto the Azure platform. And in terms of alignment with Coach to Evolve, the decide phase for Azure Migrate aligns to the plan phase of Coach to Evolve. So if you can remember, that was the second element. So this is where we're starting to understand things like your digital estate, current and future state, and so on and so forth. Then we move into the plan stage, and this is more focused really on more detailed and in-depth analysis of the workloads that you're running currently on premises. So things like, database applications, we'll start interrogating using Azure Migrate in detail, things like SQL Server configuration. It could be web applications that you have, on premises. And having a detailed technical understanding of the makeup of those applications and services. Also building upon those in terms of the dependencies. So what is dependent on the other in terms of networking connections and so on and so forth. And really getting a view of, am I faced with any technical or technology challenges to be able to move those onto the Azure platform? That's what Azure Migrate will help you understand. Can I move this as it is directly from on-prem into the Azure platform, maybe into an Azure managed SQL instance or whatever it might be? So Azure Migrate provides, a really comprehensive view of what that looks like. And indeed, it will also cover things like the servers as well, whether those are Windows servers, Linux servers, and what do they look like if I was to move them onto the Azure platform. So for instance, if you had a number of, I don't know, hypothetically server 2012 or even below, we keep coming up getting visibility of very legacy operating systems with our clients, which is a common scenario. Can I move that onto the Azure platform? Azure Migrate will tell you, and typically that will be a no. But what can I do about that? Well, maybe I need to migrate that onto a later version. And what insights can Azure Migrate provide me in terms of understanding what I need to do to achieve that sort of uplift. So that particular phase of Azure Migrate, which is the plan phase, aligns directly with the ready phase. So this is where we're starting to get, rolling up our sleeves, if you like. We're starting to get a bit more technical. We're looking at the applications, the services. We're planning what we need to in terms of Azure. And of course, before we embark on any form of migration, we need to have those landing zones in place so that there are containers there for these workloads to drop into. But plan in Azure Migrate aligns to ready. And then, simply the third phase in Azure Migrate is the execute. So Azure Migrate not only helps you understand what you've got, what that might look like on the Azure platform, it will also help you move those workloads onto the Azure platform. And that phase of Azure Migrate naturally will align to the adopt phase of Coach to Evolve. Azure Migrate is one of many tools, right, that are available. Azure Migrate is typically free of charge to use. It's very, very powerful. And it can also have integrations with a pretty broad range of third-party, more specialist assessment, technical assessment tools that can populate Azure Migrate with additional information. But a very powerful tool and something that you should absolutely consider in terms of your journey to the Azure platform. So if I just sort of talk about a few other areas as well, so a little bit of recap on some things that we've already spoken about, but also some things that you might want to consider. So I've said on a number of occasions now, and I'm going to say it again, please consider Azure landing zones before you move on to the Azure platform. It's a common thing that we see with a number of our clients. They have, taken a couple of steps into the Azure platform, and before you know it, it's grown and grown and grown, and you've got this typically mess of services that they're working, but nobody quite understands how they all work together, and they're not in that structured, organized sort of format. So billing might be very difficult when you start consuming cost on the Azure platform. So a landing zone really is absolutely essential, and it needn't be an onerous task, right? We can start simply and build up in a phased approach. The second point I want to raise is if we cast our minds back to Coach Evolve on the first phase in that framework, which is the define phase. This is something we see quite a few clients sort of not really understand the importance, and therefore are reluctant to sort of invest the time, effort, and potentially cost in executing that particular phase. It is an incredibly important phase. If you don't have a complete and thorough understanding of what the business is expecting in terms of cost, business resiliency, continuity, disaster recovery, and a whole raft of other things, that are not technical, so business processes and so on and so forth, then you're going to miss a load of those if you don't invest enough time. Really, the more time you invest in this phase, that will pay dividends to you as you move forward during that project life cycle. So when you're considering Azure and the workloads to move onto that platform, think about infrastructure as code, right? This is a really important aspect. It's something that isn't massively adopted as such. There's quite a presence, but we absolutely recommend considering this. And this ultimately means describing your Azure infrastructure and services as code, right? And there are lots of different ways of doing that. Microsoft natively will support things like ARM templates and Bicep as a way to describe that. Cocho uses Terraform. Terraform just has a much broader range or support for a whole host of third-party technologies and services. So describing your infrastructure from the beginning as code, and then managing that description of your infrastructure or that code, managing its change lifecycle. So within a DevOps repo, we can manage change to those descriptions, and then we can also implement through a very controlled and defined process the actual creation or implementation of those infrastructure as code elements through Azure DevOps pipeline. So we would typically have something like a test pipeline, a dev pipeline followed by a production pipeline, and have that very thorough, comprehensive, robust process in order to get something introduced onto or changed on the Azure platform. So infrastructure as a code, really important. Azure Arc is something that's very useful when we work with clients on helping them migrate onto the cloud. Typically, you wouldn't want to migrate everything all at once, right? That big bang approach, it's typically a phased approach. So you may well be for a period of time, and actually it may be a conscious decision that you want to stay in a hybrid setup. And Azure Arc allows you to sort of project those resources that live outside of the Azure platform into Azure. So you can start seeing within the Azure portal your services that are maybe still on premises, or maybe in any other cloud platform, right? Doesn't matter where they are, we can get an Azure Arc agent on there. We can start projecting that resource into the Azure platform. Azure Arc provides a really broad range of services. I'm not going to dig into those. Certain elements are free and certain elements have a cost associated with them, but it's a very powerful technology. When you start considering moving onto the Azure platform, this really is an ideal opportunity to start really understanding, well, what are the applications that I've got currently on premises? And it's an opportunity to start looking at, can I modernize this application? Can I sort of redesign it, refactor it to fit more efficiently, whether that be from an operational perspective or a financial perspective on the Azure platform. And to give you a really simple example, one of the clients actually that Marcus will be speaking about a little bit later, he won't be covering this particular aspect of it, but within the project that he'll cover, we helped the organization to replace an application that they were currently running, which was at the time SAP POPI or PIPO, process integration and process orchestration. So in essence, a business automation platform. Incredibly expensive. In fact, I think for that client, it was, in the millions a year. So we looked at that and went, well, okay, we can actually replicate the mechanics and the purpose of that application on the Azure platform using the broad range of Azure integration services that are available. And we did that. It was successful, and it allowed them to not renew their licenses for that expensive third-party product. Massive cost saving. And finally, again, Marcus very briefly mentioned this, or at least it was on his slide, Scout. So Scout is a Coach offering. So basically, imagine you've gone through the cloud transformation, you're running on Azure, everything is great. And now what do you do then? Well, Scout is something that will continually operate 24/7 within your Azure platform, highlighting to you areas where you can save costs. So whether that's things like reserved instances, or whether it's saving plans, whatever it might be, as well as license savings, things change. So it presents to you things that you might want to consider in terms of saving cost, but also elements of security and compliance as well. So Scout is a really effective tool to help you continually maintain that operational efficiency, both from a cost perspective and a manpower perspective. Okay, I think I might have gone a little bit over on my talk there, but Marcus, I think I'm over to you now.
Yeah, thanks, Matt, and no worries. We'll just sit through these case studies and give you time to ask questions at the end of the call. So first of all, it's Hello. So Hello Healthcare Group are behind brands like Lloyd Pharmacy, which I'm sure most of you have heard of. They have over 3,000 pharmacy branches, so a lot of moving parts, and a lot of very essential services for people in this country. So they came to us asking for help with a split from their parent company. So basically, a lot of stuff had to be moved into their environment, and at the same time, some upgrade of services and systems. So what we did, migrated their identities, made sure that they were using the latest and greatest Microsoft security, so things like conditional access, a complete overhaul of their cloud infrastructure, and moving all of the Hello applications to their own Azure instance, together with some low code and no code applications, and as Matt's already mentioned, some pretty heavy automation. Also managed device and application management, So, end user devices. So a lot of work going on. In terms of the outcome, massive cost savings for them, more than heavily justified the investment in the project, and enhanced security. So, as mentioned, conditional access, but Microsoft Defender, a lot of other tools as well going into that project to make sure that they were securing the customer interactions and their own staff interactions, and making sure that they were, mitigating any threats of breach, which are, for a pharmacy chain, very important. Important for everybody, of course. Simplified device management through Intune. So, applied that to all the end user devices in the business. And we're providing long-term IT and security support. So what they had to say about our involvement was this. So this is from the CIO of Hello Healthcare Group. Moving on. So Devika, one of the largest, in fact, the largest health insurer in Europe, but at the time that they came to us for help, they had no online account management. So they had an online presence, and it was essentially a static website. And they were, of course, very worried about losing out to competitors, smaller organizations who were therefore, a lot more agile, and, a lot of them kind of launched with online account management built into their services. So what we did, they asked for a sign-in process, which basically connected their customers to their back-end account. So they had to prove who they were through various credentials and an activation code that they were sent in the post. Set up a password, set up MFA, and then they could access their documents. So since then, they've moved to email activation, because a lot more of their customers have email. But yeah, so essentially we provided most of this via Azure Active Directory B2C, the forerunner of Entra External ID for customers. So what was the outcome? So we built this account activation, including this, on first time online activation, and then subsequent sign-in, password reset, and so on. Transferred all of the knowledge to their IT teams. This went into a rapid website pilot and then mobile app integration, and they've developed it further since, and have therefore regained their competitive edge. So just a quick plug for our cloud discovery call. So this is a 1-hour call free of charge with one of our account managers and one of our consultants or architects, and this will help you kind of take the next step in your journey and figure out, what kind of planning and development you need, and what kind of budget is required. There may be Microsoft funding as well for these kind of developments. They're quite keen on, as you might expect, moving people into Azure consumption. But for now, let's go to questions. If you do have a question, please post it in the Q&A. You'll find a Q&A button at the top of the Teams window.
Okay, well, I've got a couple here, Marcus. So this one's relating specifically to landing zones, so I'd take this one. So we don't have a landing zone at the moment. Can we retrospectively adopt one? Short answer to that is yes. Obviously, better to do it before you start, but we can absolutely accommodate that retrospective implementation of a landing zone. It just means we go through the same process, we end up with a landing zone, and then we have to consider moving some of those resources into the relevant landing zones. Now, that in itself is pretty straightforward, but we might need to do things like consideration of moving to a different subscription, some resources. In fact, I think all of them now can move between subscriptions, but there are things that we need to consider. So the short answer is yes, we can do that. Another one I've got here is about cost for Azure Arc. So I mentioned that on my last slide. So Azure Arc is free for some things and not free for others. So if we want to, in the scenario that I talked about where Azure Arc might be useful, which is about we haven't migrated everything yet and we're going to remain in that hybrid scenario for a while, then how do we project our resources into that sort of single pane of glass, which will be the Azure portal? Well, we use Azure Arc for that. If we're talking about things like server instances, then yes, we can do that free of charge. But there are a number of different things like SQL management and so on and so forth that will incur a cost. The best thing to better understand that is just go to the Azure pricing calculator. Look for Azure Arc, and all of the information will be there. And you can actually plug in a lot of figures if you want to go to this level around, what is my SQL Server typically doing, and therefore what is the cost that I'm likely to see, because a lot of these are transactional, right? They're based on how busy certain things are, which can be quite difficult to estimate. Yeah, have you got one?
Cool. No, I was just saying thank you.
Okay, cool.
I think that is it in terms of questions. So just a reminder about our cloud discovery call. And thank you very much for attending this afternoon's webinar, and hope to speak to you in person soon.
Brilliant. Thank you all.